My name's Tom Lavers. I'm a senior lecturer here at GDI and work on politics of development myself and have also been leading ESTID's research on the politics of social protection over the last few years. But more importantly, today we have Dan Slater with us and very much looking forward to his seminar. Dan is the Ronald and Eileen Weiser Professor of Emerging Democracies and also the Director of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies at the University of Michigan, and has done a whole lot of research on particularly focusing on issues around authoritarianism and democratic transitions, state building and the politics of economic development in East Asia. He's probably best known for his 2010 book on ordering power, contentious politics and authoritarian leviathans in Southeast Asia. And also a book that I wrote quite recently in 2018 on coercive distribution with some colleagues. And his work has been very influential on many of us involved in ESTID, myself included. So it's great to have him with us and presenting some of his new work today on clustering development and democratization in Asia. So just in terms of the format, before I hand over to Dan, he's going to talk for about 30 minutes. And then that should leave us with about 30 minutes for questions and discussion afterwards. I would suggest if you have questions that come up during the presentation, feel free to put those in the chat box during the presentation. I can try and collate those and put them to Dan afterwards. And also, in the Q&A itself, feel free to use that raise hand function to put up your hand and let yourself know that you want to ask a question. I can hand over to you to ask Dan directly. So I will leave it there and hand over to Dan for 30 minutes.
Well, thanks, Tom, and thanks to everyone involved with inviting me, and thanks for the very flattering introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here and join this conversation, especially because, as Tom suggested, I've been doing more work lately on questions of democratization and authoritarianism, and haven't been writing as much about economic development and trying to sort of explain economic development as an outcome, although that was sort of my main motivation for beginning to study Asia in the first place. And so I've been kind of revisiting some of these questions about economic development and the developmental state as sort of a foundation for this book project I'm working on working with Joseph Wong at the University of Toronto, a book called Democracy Through Strength, Asia's Development and Democratization. And the book sort of starts from the premise that to understand variation in democratization in Asia, one has to understand the role of economic development, not simply from a modernization perspective in which more development means more democracy, but in which different types of development give different proclivities toward democratization. In particular, in East Asia, East and Southeast Asia, a sort of pattern of democratization we call democracy through strength, in which a ruling party or military decides preemptively to democratize, even though they're not sort of under pressure of being overthrown. And so rather than a regime collapsing, it's an authoritarian regime conceding democratic reforms, allowing a level playing field, and essentially conceding not defeat, but conceding democratic reforms. So that's sort of the gist of the book. But in exploring this topic, it's sort of become clear to me that there is a way in which we need to rethink geographic space in Asia, I think, to be able to make sense of these patterns. And that there's a remarkable correlation, a remarkable correspondence, I would say, between the kinds of development that are experienced in different parts of Asia and whether or not these countries have at some point in the post-World War II period actually pursued democracy through strength, whether authoritarian regimes have taken the risk of liberalizing, starting to democratize their countries or not. So let me get into the start here. And I'll just say a few words at the start about developmental states in general. I think it might be of interest for the crowd here. And I think the literature on developmental states is making a bit of a comeback over the last few years. And I think there are kind of a few big issues in that literature that I want to sort of speak to and say how I think this book with Joe might speak to those literatures. So one is that I think there's kind of an ongoing tension in the literature between those who see developmental states as an outcome as opposed to an orientation. So what makes a state a developmental state? And those of us who work in East Asia have often thought of it as like only several states should be considered developmental states, only if they're able to accomplish technological upgrading, beyond just basic structural change and industrialization. So, and if you haven't, you're not a developmental state. And there's something to that perspective. But I also think, when I read the literature from Latin America or Africa or the Middle East, looking at developmental states, I think it's seen more as an orientation. So the idea is that states that are geared toward economic development in certain ways are sort of seen as developmental states. And so in this book and in this talk, I'll be kind of taking both perspectives in a way. And I think hopefully it'll be clear in what way I think it's useful to think about developmental states, both in terms of orientation and outcomes. Second, I think that there's kind of in the more recent literature, we see that it's not just about the state. Developmental state literature inevitably looks at other institutions, whether it's firms, whether it's political parties, different kinds of legal systems, all sorts of other institutions besides the bureaucracy, which in some form of alliance or some form of shared developmental agenda are what make the difference. So I think I'll be going outside just the state apparatus, in this talk as well. And I think one needs to understand the processes in developmental states. Third, I think that it's very clear that the international context in which developmental states now exist and try to thrive has changed dramatically in terms of possibilities for export-led growth. And I think all along it's been the case that the international context is really quite important. So even though we think of developmental states in kind of a methodologically nationalist way, it shouldn't blind us to the ways in which international context matters. So we'll be talking about the geopolitics a bit here as well. And last but not least, I think particularly in terms of ESID's themes, obviously we've moved away from thinking of development only as economic growth and thinking more in terms of, development requires the kind of social protection that Tom was mentioning, I think environmental protection, political inclusion, and as Amartya Sen would argue, development as freedom. And so although the focus here is largely on growth, the fact that these kinds of economic development have such profound implications, I think, for democratization at least, hopefully gives us some window onto the ways in which, again, economic development growth is not just an outcome to be explained, but it's a process in the world which has profound implications for the politics of inclusion, the politics of freedom, the politics of human rights. Okay, so the argument that we make here in the book is that we can think of developmental Asia as a historical setting. So rather than dividing the region into Northeast and Southeast Asia as per usual, what we do is think of this as developmental Asia, and we define this region politically. So these are Northeast and Southeast Asian polities that have followed a state-sponsored export-led strategy of rapid economic growth and what we often call catch-up, but have done so with widely varying degrees of commitment and success. So it includes cases that have not been all that developmentally successful, some very successful, some less so, but all are sort of within this kind of flying geese pattern to some degree, following Japan and trying to pursue kind of economic growth with a large role for the state. These are not highly neoliberal economies for the most part. Okay, so this region, developmental Asia, we argue, is determined politically, not just geographically. So it's a region that a country in Northeast or Southeast Asia has to actually join with certain policies and a certain developmental orientation. So countries like the Philippines, North Korea, Laos, Brunei, Mongolia, there are lots of countries in Northeast and Southeast Asia that do not fit within what we call developmental Asia as a broad region. And then you can basically time the entry of other countries into the region as well. So China effectively started joining developmental Asia with its economic reforms after 1978. Myanmar, Cambodia, even more recently than that. And so this, again, I think is a different way of thinking about political space and region. Whereas, of course, if you're in Northeast Asia or Southeast Asia, that's a permanent feature that doesn't change with your strategies. One key point about this region, I think, is that it's a zone of shifting and overlapping geopolitical influences, American, British, Japanese, and Chinese influence. And I think this is vital for kind of correcting the perception, especially in democratization studies, that this is a very Sino-centric region in which Chinese authoritarianism has this big diffusing and sort of has an effect on encouraging authoritarianism in other parts of the region, which I think is not really correct, and that we have to recognize the longstanding role of the U.S., the British, and the Japanese in this region as well. But the ways, part of what's going to make this a clustered region, I argue, is whether or not which of these powers has had the greatest influence. And so what we argue is that this region, this broad region, developmental Asia, has 4 identifiable clusters within it, which show distinctive types of developmentalism. Okay, so we're going to have 4 clusters, and that these clusters of developmentalism profoundly shape regime variation, specifically whether or not these countries have ever at some point attempted to democratize from a position of strength. Okay, let me see. It's not letting me, there we go. I'm trying to both be able to see my screen and manage this, sorry. So let me see if I can try to drop these. There's a lot in my way here. Okay, sorry. So, as I said, so developmental Asia, we can think of as four clusters of cases. And in a way, they're mismatched pairs in the sense of, let me see, did I skip up? It's gonna keep doing this, hold on, sorry. Did I, yeah, I think I jumped over some slides there. Sorry about that. Okay, so 4 clusters, 12 cases, and these can be arranged both kind of horizontally and vertically. So the 4 clusters are what we call developmental statism. So these are the 3 cases: Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea, which are sort of the canonical paradigmatic developmental states, both in terms of their orientations and their outcomes. The other set of particularly high strength, high success developmental cases in developmental Asia, we call developmental Britannia, which is Singapore, Hong Kong, and Malaysia. And then at more intermediate institutional strength and at sort of more low to middle income cases, we have 2 additional clusters: the developmental militarist cluster, Indonesia, Thailand, and Myanmar, and then the developmental socialist cluster of China, Vietnam, and Cambodia. So that's the region we define as developmental Asia. And the argument here is that these clusters are going to map onto regime outcomes. So, sorry, there we go. Okay, so text here. All right, so the idea, so if it were just the case that more economically developed clusters were more likely to democratize, then you would just sort of say, well, modernization theory looks pretty good in Asia. But in fact, it's not that that economic development is unimportant, but it's really the type that matters. So if we look at the levels of development in the 4 clusters I just introduced to you. So the red line is the developmental status cluster. Remember, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea. The black is the Britannia cluster, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Singapore. The blue is the militarist cluster, Indonesia, Thailand, Myanmar, and the green one is the developmental socialist cluster, China, Vietnam, and Cambodia. And what we see here is, obviously we have, you see the clear variation in levels of economic development, right? 2 highly developed, 2 that are obviously growing, but are much lower levels of economic development, right? And so the key point here, as I'm going to say, is that it doesn't map onto regime outcomes, because I think what's happening, okay, sorry about that. What we see instead is that the red and the green, so the statist cluster and the socialist cluster map onto their hypothesized regime type in the sense of high versus low economic development, having democratized through strength and not. But the black and the blue, the Britannia and the militarist clusters are flip-flopped. So again, if we look here, you see the red and the green. Here we go, development, democracy, development, democracy. You see the black and the blue are not simply mapping onto levels of economic development at all, right? So the Britannia cluster has, you could say, underperformed its expectations, given levels of development in terms of political regime change, whereas the militarist cluster, despite much lower levels of development than, say, the Britannia cluster, has actually overperformed, at least in terms of whether or not these kind of experiments with democracy through strength have been attempted. They haven't necessarily succeeded or been completed, but these experiments at least have taken place. So kind of most simply, so the question is, well, why would it be that economic development under an authoritarian regime should shape the possibility for and the prospects of democracy through strength? The argument we make is that basically authoritarian regimes are most likely to undertake these experiments to try to open up the political system when they enjoy what we call both victory confidence and stability confidence, which I'll talk a little bit more in a moment. But in quite simple terms, if an authoritarian regime enjoys high levels of economic development, it enjoys a track record which it can then use to help legitimate itself as then a competitor in democratic politics. So your developmental track record as an authoritarian regime could allow you to then compete successfully in democracy, so giving you victory confidence in elections. And to the extent that economic development leads to poverty reduction, it also gives you greater, what we call stability confidence. So more confidence that opening up the political system, allowing more freedoms and rights is not going to lead to either extremely intense redistributive demands or more instability, okay? So, but this is just put in terms of economic development. What's missing from this picture is the institutions, okay? And at the heart of the idea of different clusters is the idea that economic development is always associated with certain types of institutions. And those institutions, I'd argue, are clustered in distinctive ways that I think give us different insight than if you just think about levels of development. Okay, so again, we can't see anything. If we think of this in terms of developmental institutions and these kinds of confidence about democracy, it's really antecedent state strength that's the main source of stability confidence. So this is the expectation that political stability and economic development will persist under democratic conditions. And then antecedent party strength is the main source of victory confidence, which is the expectation of faring well in democratic elections. So what we really want to do when looking at these authoritarian regimes is look at their developmental track record, look at their record of poverty reduction, and then look at to what extent strong state institutions, but also strong party institutions, or even in some cases, more cohesive military institutions have been presiding over and have been leading forces in this process of economic development. Okay, so if we think about this, kind of how this sort of emerges as a way of thinking about this, if we think in terms of just, because it's critical to note that there's a real spectrum here, right? That these are 12 very, very diverse cases. Some are kind of, canonical developmental Asian cases like, Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, and some are really on the borderline. Cases like Cambodia, Myanmar are barely in developmental Asia, if at all. And I think, it's debatable whether one would include them or not. But if you just eyeball this spectrum of strength, right, and sort of think vertically through this chart here, and on the left, what we see are the 6 cases that have at some time pursued democracy through strength. The 6 on the right have all not, and then the highest case is the one that's has had the most developmental success and generally the strongest institutions. What you kind of see, and this is sort of how this kind of idea inductively emerged, is there's a real kind of clustering going on here. Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, you see are together, Indonesia, Thailand, Myanmar, and then on the other side, Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong, China, Vietnam, Cambodia. And because one thing that became clear as we were thinking through this is how would one compare the institutional strength of, say, China to South Korea? Or how would one compare the institutional strength of, say, Taiwan and Singapore? And part of what we concluded was that you really can't compare them directly. And the reason why is because they're in different clusters. They have different kinds of institutional strength. So the idea is to move away from this view of the world in which they're all lumped together and move into a world where we're clustering them instead, so we can compare like with like and think about why they're in the cluster that they are. So this to me is a better way of looking at the variation that we see. So again, what we have here are the 2 high development clusters at the top of your screen, and the 2 more intermediate levels of development and institutional strength at the lower parts of your screen. And so again, if in the cases that are italicized are the ones that are either democratic or at some point have attempted democratic concessions, the ones on the ones that are not italicized are not. And what you can see is that essentially there's in a way, arguably a perfect non-correlation between raw levels of developmental success, institutional strength, and whether or not countries pursue these democratic reforms. Otherwise, you'd see all italics on the top, non-italics on the bottom, but instead the italics go vertically, right? So it's both one stronger cluster, one weaker cluster that have done these reforms, and a cluster that have not as well, okay? So why does clustering matter? And this to me is sort of the most kind of inchoate part of this research for me. This is, I think, I mean, I look forward to feedback on everything, but if people know of others who have kind of tried to take a clustered approach to development and have thought about these things, I'd be very curious for input on this. But so a few reasons why clustering matters. One is just strictly the levels of development. Those are highly correlated, that there tends to be similar levels of development within each of these 4 clusters. as I've argued, the types of institutions are vital here, right? And for a variety of reasons we can talk about in Q&A, the kinds of political and economic institutions you have, I think make you more or less likely to perceive an acute need to pursue democratic reform or not. A third critical factor, I think, is the violence or lack of violence that attended the origins of these regimes, because this speaks to the question of stability confidence. So when, and this is kind of the point of my first book, which Tom mentioned, Ordering Power, that when authoritarian regimes contemplate the risks, and when all kinds of elites contemplate the risks of democratic reform, they tend to think about what patterns of conflict looked like before the authoritarian regime was established. So in different clusters, I think it's easier in some and harder than in others to establish stability confidence. We obviously see different ideologies across these different clusters. Here, the developmental socialist cluster, I think, stands out. Different kind of ideology toward the economy, late coming into developmental Asia at all, given the difficulty of making commensurate socialist ideology with the kind of rapid capitalist growth that we see in developmental Asia. The different clusters have very different geopolitical dependencies. So in some, we see a lot of dependence on the United States. In some, we see closer connections to China or closer historical connections to Japan, which again, I think lead to very different positioning. And we have very different territorial dynamics as well. So in the militarist cluster in particular, you have this more chronic problem of regional insurgencies, separatist insurgencies, which again creates concerns for stability confidence that even as a country gets richer, creates a sense of risk that attends to the possibility of democratic reform. So these are some, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are some reasons why clustering might matter. So what I want to do in the last 10 minutes or so that I have is just talk about two of the four clusters, the two that have historically attempted democracy through strength. And again, just to reiterate the fact, these are two clusters that are at dramatically different levels of economic development. I mean, both might be thought of as, mostly a set of relative success cases in the developing world, but the levels are quite different. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the developmental statist cluster first, and then I'll talk about the developmental militarist cluster to conclude. So the developmental statist cluster of Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. So what do they have in common? These are all these techno-nationalist developmental states with rapid growth records. Again, these are, no matter how one defines developmental state, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea are cases that you're going to be including in that cluster. So just to give you one example of why it is that economic development policies and particular institutions have such profound implications for democracy, think about land reform. So all three of these cases had very aggressive land reform policies, right? Now, one thing that did was reduce poverty, which is good, for stability confidence. But another thing that land reform did in these cases was it reduced the political role of landlords and of large landowners. And what that does in terms of political regimes is it removes from the stage the social actor most likely to be a sort of devoted opponent of democratization, which is the large kind of labor repressive landed elite. So to the extent that what land reform did was replaced landlords in the countryside with party politicians, often clientelistic politicians who were basically delivering pork barrel goods to the countryside. These are the kind of folk, conservatives, who can actually win elections and don't fear democratization so much. So that's one example, but none of the other clusters have land reform like this. So this is one reason why we think developmental statism has not just been highly democratic, but very stably democratic, okay? So as just noted, that what you have is these experienced conservative parties and candidates in the countryside. In all three cases, a very tight security alliance with the United States gave political leverage, geopolitical leverage to the United States to push for democratization. I don't think the US role was necessarily dispositive, but I think that it certainly is one reason why this cluster looks different from others. In all three of these cases, these regimes had very, very violent regime origins, which in one sense is a negative for stability confidence. But on the other hand, it's crucial that in all three of these cases during the Cold War, the communist threat was more external than internal. And as a result, opening up the political process, allowing democratization, majoritarian elections did not mean that you're competing with a very, very radical left in elections, which in other parts of developmental Asia has been the case and has been a barrier to democratic reform from the perspective of elites contemplating the risks of reform. All three of these cases, when democratic concessions came, they came with very high levels of victory confidence and stability confidence, and that confidence has been basically confirmed. All of these places see conservative political parties as highly successful ongoing actors in the political system. The LDP in Japan is the extreme example, where they virtually never lose, but the KMT, and then the Conservative Party in South Korea, whose name changes from time to time, also, again, major actor. They were hardly swept away by democratic reforms. So this is the developmental status cluster, and it looks quite different from any other ones. Now, the next one we're going to look at, and I'll conclude with, the militarist cluster. They did historically also, you saw these regimes pursue democratic reforms in moments when conservatives and incumbents had substantial strength, but it looks quite different. So in the developmental militarist cluster, Indonesia, Thailand, and Myanmar, we see very different political economies. So here we see not the kind of strong embedded autonomous bureaucracies of the status cluster, but more military patrimonial institutions, which prevented the dominance of the kind of party states that we saw dominant in the status cluster, and we would also see in the socialist cluster, in cases like China and Vietnam. Development in this region has been much more led with foreign direct investment, and it's been much more natural resource dependent. And that natural resource dependency and the combination with FDI has meant several things. One is it means that Northeast Asian investors play a much larger role in this region. So this region is less directly US dependent as the first cluster we looked at. But also this resource dependence has spawned quite endemic authoritarian rent seeking. And so what you have in these cases is one real barrier to democratization is that the old elite, military, the monarchy in Thailand, others are deeply embedded in these rent-seeking networks, which they fear being disrupted under democratization. So this is one reason why it's harder and harder to do these democratic reforms, because of a lack of stability confidence, a lack of confidence among these regime elites that they'll be able to keep the good times going. This region clearly has had much less, but still meaningful poverty reduction and urbanization. Not like the status cluster, but again, compared to many parts of the world, pretty substantial success on these fronts. Myanmar, of course, the least. Again, this is a spectrum of cases. All also had modest but informative authoritarian electoral experience. So it matters if under the authoritarian period, the regime actually holds multi-party elections, even if they're not fully competitive, because it gives valuable information to the regime about what would likely happen if the regime were to democratize. So here's a clear contrast with the other more middle to low income cluster, the socialist cluster. So in a case like China or Vietnam, they don't have the same kind of multi-party electoral experience, which would be informative for thinking about, well, if say China were to democratize through strength, how would the CCP fare versus possible rivals as they emerged? In a place like Indonesia and Thailand, Myanmar, they had more of an idea going in what elections would look like based on that experience. Now, the fact that the military is dominant in all of these cases also matters in the sense of the relative weight of stability confidence and victory confidence. Militaries are not as concerned with the results of elections, as long as they can basically fulfill their prerogatives through other institutional maneuvers, whether it's guaranteed seats in parliament or different kinds of election systems or what have you. So a big defeat for the old ruling party in cases like Indonesia, Thailand, Myanmar do not have the same implications for the military. So the military can countenance as long as they don't think democracy is going to mean instability. Now, again, all three of these cases, we see territorial separatism and regional conflict in a way that the other three clusters do not. So that's been, again, an ongoing barrier to a complication to democratic reform. I think one of the main reasons that the Thaksin regime fell in 2006 was perceived mismanagement of the conflict in the south in Thailand. And so again, as military elites lose stability confidence, they lose the confidence that democracy and stability can go together. They're liable to turn against democracy. And so all three of these cases have had, compared with the status cluster I just discussed, they've had much rockier authoritarian endings with considerable reversion risk. Now, in one of those cases, Thailand, you've had outright, obviously, democratic collapse. The military has come back in full force, although I don't think they'll be able to do so forever. And we see the rising protests there now. And I think it's hard to separate the protests we see in Thailand right now from questions of economic development, the size of the political confidence of the urban middle class in Thailand. Indonesia is also having pretty serious democratic struggles, but has also, again, probably outperformed expectations in terms of how it's done the past 20 years. And Myanmar, I think, is a case where, as we saw with the elections this weekend, a case where, again, if we think of democracy through strength as a kind of reversible political experiment, and one which either could be completed or not, I think the question of whether or not Myanmar will sort of complete a democratic transition remains very, very much in question and in doubt. But again, part of the point we're making in this book is to say that's not unexpected, given the fact that Myanmar is the weakest case for our theory, right? It's got the least strength of any of the cases that indeed tried to pursue democratic concessions at a time when it was not under direct threat of overthrow. And so the fact that we see much more stable, successful democratic trajectories in the developmental status cluster I just discussed than in the militarist cluster, I think is inexplicable without understanding levels of economic development, but also, more importantly, the types of economic development and the way that different kinds of political institutions have been associated with economic development in these different clusters of cases. So that's kind of the how developmental clustering fits into the book that Joe Wong and I are writing, and I'll sort of leave it there and look forward to your questions.